There's so many different interpretations of what gesture is. In the animation industry, we use a term called line of action. And that tends to be thought of as being the gesture of a pose. In reality, it's not. Most of the people who originally started teaching and writing about animation, they didn't study animation. These were illustrators, these were painters. If you look at the books at that time on art, Andrew Loomis is a good example, where he takes and diagrams some of the old masters, and where he uses these simple lines to take and show the directions of the figures and how they relate to each other. That's basically line of action. Now, that has been carried over in the publications and stuff that this is the gesture. But it's not the gesture. Okay, let me demonstrate. Okay, first what we have, if we have, this is a very, very simple figure now. If I'm just taking and saying that, okay, here's a figure that, see, it's arm up here, and we're coming down, and let's say the leg is stretched back, we're coming through, and what would normally be considered line of action, this would be thought of as the line of action. Compositionally, that's what it would be. Okay, now, where's the difference? Okay, well, if I'm starting this figure, the gesture now, and I'll just go over this, would be, which way is this head turned? How do we feel the torso? Maybe the torso is taking and turning slightly this way. Maybe the pelvis is twisting across, coming over into here. So how the different components of the figure take and work with each other, that's really the gesture. So that when I'm taking and talking about gesture, I'm talking about how the body moves, how the head turns, how the shoulder moves, all of those subtle little points that really give us body language. And body language is expression. Okay, it's the way we communicate. We communicate with body language. If I take and do something like that, it reads. Okay, it's not an overall simple line now, so that the subtleties of action, of how the parts are integrated one to the other, how we move a hand, how the hand turns, these are all body movements. These are gesture. So when you're taking and doing a gesture, it's the action, it's literally the core of your drawing. So if we begin with the idea is that a gesture, an action, is the equivalent of a story point. It is the story of your drawing in a way. It's taking, and it's the essence of what you're trying to achieve. So now, step one. And we'll just take and work right here for a moment. And this is sort of my standard point that I'm always lecturing on, is that if I take simple lines like this. Okay. Now, often the student will look at that and say, well, that's animation. That obviously it's your eye is moving across the page. But in reality, this doesn't come from animation. It's the simple tool, and it goes all the way back. We can see it in the Greeks, Romans, the Renaissance. It's a transition from one point to the next, Transition. But a transition, well, if you think about it, that's what animation is. It's a transition from one point to the next. It's movement. Animation is movement. The Renaissance is movement. The big difference between the Renaissance, say, and the Bauhaus basic design is movement. The Renaissance, what we found, that the artists were telling stories. They had to take and make the eye move to take and communicate a story, but they were also creating an experience at the same time. So if you happen to go to, say, Pompeii in Italy, there's a room called the House of Mysteries. If you walk into that room, they take and lead you around the room so that you literally read the story in sequence. The sequence going how you take and make a transition from one point to the next point to the next point. This is a really critical element of drawing now. We're talking about how you organize the lines in your drawing to communicate. Okay, part of that is now that the confusion in a classroom, I run into this all the time. First class, like a day, and I start talking about, well, we're doing some warm-up gesture drawings. I see people moving their hand like crazy. How you move your hand, how fast you move your hand has absolutely nothing to do with capturing a gesture. The artist doesn't draw with his hands, he draws with his brain. That's Michelangelo. That's what he said. Okay, the artist draws with his brain, not his hand. So the process of thinking is the process of now analyzing and having something to analyze and communicating it. This is all gesture drawing. Okay, it sounds like I'm making this very, very complicated. Okay, but that's in a way it's such an important element in the drawing that we understand the sort of all of the levels of complexity that come together. Okay, so in doing this now, if I take and do a simple thing like that. Okay, what we're working with is, again, it's continuity, but this experience is different than that experience. If I come through and I do that, it's still, I'm leading the eye from one point to the next. That's a different experience than that to that. Now, what if I take and I come in and I do there's no movement. There's no movement happening there. It's just chaos. If we're taking and, like, say, okay, the Renaissance storytelling, but that's already, if you think about what came before the Renaissance, we have medieval art. These were icons. These were symbols for things that people recognized. The symbols, the stories were there. But it was not movement. The Renaissance had to do with story. They were telling a story. As we go into the whole period of the modern art, well, the whole thing was removing the story and focusing purely on the abstract elements, the tools. These are all the elements today. They've been codified into sort of a tools of design. Straight against curve, big, small, balance. A balanced, perfectly balanced picture does not have movement. So when I'm drawing a gesture, I'm talking about movement. So an integral part of making a moving, feeling the action of something is drawing the lines in such a way that they actually communicate in themselves movement. Now, the mechanics of actually doing the drawing. And what confuses people is that the drawings look so free and loose that I do, and yet they're very calculated. Okay, so there's a contradiction here. But what it is that you have to integrate the tools. You have to integrate the tools of drawing so that there's no separation between your feeling and your thoughts. There aren't any rules. Okay? First, there's no rules. There are tools. that can be used many, many different ways. Okay, so it's the tools that we're talking about. Now, when I'm teaching, I try to communicate the tools in such a way that they become integrated into your thinking. It's the exact same thing. Now, if you were taking and studying karate or learning to play the piano, you do repetition, 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 repetition until you no longer have to think about it. What you're doing, you're training the neurons in your brain to take and function automatically without thinking. And that's really what we do. So what I suggest as you're doing it, to always start the drawing and always go through the drawing the same way. Then as you develop your skills, you can take and do all kinds of stuff. Okay, the integral part first is that we're always working for the total. Why do I start with the head? Okay, if you're taking the head, if you take the eye, so I use an example given by my friend Sheldon, who's part of the New Masters Academy here. What he's taken, Sheldon's a great anime, very, very close friend of mine. Anyway, so I don't think he'll mind if I steal his thing here. But just pretend like the eyes are like on a string, on a magnet, or on a mannequin. And you pull the string and the eyes are going to go, well, very quickly. The head is going to go with the eyes. And then as the head goes, the shoulders go. As the shoulders go, the waist, the pelvis. It's this movement that takes place. So the head is really the sort of the governing thing. Well, not only in terms of just overall body movement, but expression. Expression is a critical part of any action. So to start with, we don't really focus so much on the expression. We're basically dealing with body language. But you start with the big things, and then you break it down to smaller and smaller and smaller units as we go along. But first you get the total. Okay, so now as I start with the head, I take and now, one of the things you're going to notice is that I don't draw very fast. Actually, I draw quite slow. Everything, it looks simple, but there's a lot of thought that goes into play. The old cliche of when I was a student was 3 looks, 2 thinks, 1 application. And this is sort of a basic mantra thing. So I'm always looking or think. I am very, very seriously, constantly thinking about what it is that I'm doing. Okay, so even in something as simple as just blocking that head, I'm already thinking, well, there's an axis to it. I made it tilt. Then if I come in, I don't necessarily draw that, but that's precisely what I'm thinking. So as I start that head, I'm going over the surface, and I'm coming down, and I'm thinking this, and then I'll come through, and I'll do this. It may be done very quickly. Now, so then as I go through here, as I'm pulling, I'm thinking, well, okay, this line, and I would also at the same point here, I would be taking and indicating, is the head is tilted? I could maybe even put a dot at the top of the head to help show that. I may even draw an ear and think of where the front is. So every line that I put down is communicating something. There's nothing extraneous. So I'm not sketching, I'm drawing. Okay, so as I go through now, as I think, okay, let's imagine here that we have a figure that is taking and sort of leaning out towards us a little bit. Maybe we've got a pelvis that is turned. So as I'm going through, I'm taking and I do a lot of movements in the air without actually touching the paper. And I'll come through and I say, well, okay, it's going over here. Coming on, feeling, this is over here. And maybe if there's actually a twist, I may draw a line that gives us a twist. Okay, now let's take and sort of analyze what I've done so far. And this is an important part. I use the term brainware. We have brainware. We have in computers, we have 2D and 3D software. But we have brainware. We have ways of taking, and we can see things. We've got a lot. We know a lot. These are serious tools that we use to take and communicate with. They're like words. Okay, so as I come through now, I'm saying the eye. Notice what I've done is I've taken and leading the eye, using one line, leading the eye to the next line. These are pulling across the surface to make you experience that this is over here. In other words, I'm coming across, making the eye move in here. It's not one line. And this is a point that is a distinct difference between, say, in general, way illustrators work. When you have a model and you have a pose that you're going to take and use to do a painting, you're not worrying about how to take and integrate that with something. You've already figured that out. Okay, so that what we're doing is taking and we want to duplicate that thing. So what you find in that case, we would be taking, say, maybe dealing with coming in, looking at a line, coming down, coming across, looking at these shapes. So as we're coming across, the eye is moving. Okay, so at the same time, so now I'm coming through, and maybe I would be taking and saying, let's say this leg is coming across. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing through the figure. I'm making lines that I'm just going through the figure, and I'm trying to experience the total as I do it. And I may change, may adjust thing. Now, but we have to do this. We have to take and communicate this action, this gesture, with both two-dimensionally and three-dimensionally. So at this point, these lines, this is obviously very two-dimensional. It has movement, it has a flow to it, but it's not three-dimensional. So what's the most fundamental tool for taking and describing some three-dimensionally? We can go back and you can look at the Greeks. We could look at Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael. You find the essential tool that they use for taking and showing very simply three-dimension is to take and use lines that go across and around the figure. So I can make these objects take and change direction. I can take and make this move in any which way I want. And you're going to take and understand this three-dimensionally. And I can feel the eye coming through. Okay, so as this figure is exactly what we just did to start with the head. Wrapping a line around it shows the action. Shows you, I should say, not the action, but the tilt of the head. So if I come through and say, well, okay, I'm thinking, see, this is the part that creates a lot of problems for the student, is that what you're doing when you're doing a gesture drawing, you're thinking, you're capturing something. It's not necessarily for public consumption. It's usually you do it for yourself. It's done when you're drawing from imagination. You're trying to bring an idea out of your head that doesn't exist. And of course, if you're doing other than realistic type stuff, and even realistic, but if you're doing fantasy works, what have you, you don't have something to take and draw from. It is all from imagination. Okay? And so as I'm drawing, then I'm taking and coming saying, well, okay, this is pulling out. This figure is pulling out. And as I'm doing that, then I may say, well, okay, maybe the pelvis is taking and going a different direction. So this is for me. This is for me trying to understand what that figure is doing. And so if I come across, if I have a arm going up in here, we're finding that I go over that surface. Okay, so at this point, I'm talking about two tools. Okay, the next difficulty that the student has, and this is, I travel all over the world teaching drawing. The first thing that I take and tell a class is we do not copy. Okay, but everybody starts out studying and learning how to draw by copying. They take and copy the contour of something. We don't copy the contour. We create the contour with using forms. So the next tool then is literally the creation or containing of form. So in doing that, the containing is, if we have, for instance, the most simple terms, if we have a word, let's say Vilppu here, okay, and we put brackets around it, that's containing. Really simple. Okay, so if I take and come around here and say, well, okay, I'm thinking of the rib cage, and I come through and I do this, I'm containing it. At the same time, I'm taking and giving a preliminary contour of the form. I'm drawing form. Okay, so this then, as I take and come through and I start thinking of the pelvis, I'm coming in and I go over surface here. Well, I'm containing, but now there's more to it than just containing, more to it than just bracketing. The bracket itself is a tool that deals with symmetry. So we're always dealing with symmetry. That's how we recognize. I mean, you can see when I tilt my shoulder, it's the symmetry of having two sides to it that has an angle that is taking and telling us that I've tilted my shoulder. Where you tilt your head, the pull, the change. So as I do this, so there's a line across here, and we can see that this is a symmetry here. Well, these are actually working at right angles to basically the center of your form. So as I'm going through the figure, and I'm thinking that, okay, first thing I was taking and just trying to feel the flow of how the thing.